She'll start in 3, 2, and 1. There are two main stakeholders that we believe, all propositions believed, are actually important in this debate. First of all is the locals, right? We're all debating on the locals. And the question is, what do they actually want when travelers go to their region or country? Like any other locals, we want to spread the word about our region and want tourists to experience the unique beauty of Caribbean. And profit is also another factor because, people, they work for survival, they work so that they can support their own families. As for another stakeholders, as we have mentioned, which is on cruise lines or private companies or foreign companies, they're the one who actually control these cruise own private islands. To note that even though these islands are widespread in the Caribbean, they aren't actively owned by the people there and have the power to buy, they are not actively owned by the people living in the Caribbean, but instead those are outsiders, those are foreigners who have the power to buy long leases and control land and regulate who gets across effectively, and they can even have the ability to carving out the territory also. So what this means is that they're basically taking over the main economic growth of the Caribbean people, or the people in the Caribbean. So the goal for both sides are really simple because it's all about which side can actually protect the most vulnerable groups and also protect the culture and the authenticity of tourists and traveling when it comes to the specific region of the Caribbean. So now we'll come to the most important part in this speech, which is the clashes. First of all, we have the clash on how the rise actually affects local people. Because note the fact that this is not a debate about the pros and cons of the cruise-owned private islands, no. We strongly believe that the rise of this, the rise of the cruise-owned private islands becoming too popular, actually has a huge detrimental impact on the locals and the people as a whole. So first of all, a couple of things. Cruise lines, they have the ability to exploit the fact that these islands are impoverished so that they buy cheap land, they pay low wages, and use the desperation of locals to justify their presence, right? But they don't invest in public schools, they don't invest in hospitals or infrastructure, but they build private beaches, they build their own territory so that they can lure tourists in, which you don't understand how later on opposition can just tell you that these private owned islands have the ability to fund medicine field or other kinds of field like education. They don't have any significant mechanism when talking about this. So first of all, opposition said to you that cruise ship keeps tourists in the country longer, and now locals, they get hired on these cruise and they get to live a better life. We don't understand how and why, because these are actually big benefits as the money stays with the cruise lines altogether. Yes, cruise ships actually bring tourists, but those tourists, they stay on these private islands. They spend money at those cruise-owned bars, shops, or tours, and they actually rarely interact with the real country. Because locals, they don't actually get to run businesses. Instead, they work for services, they get low-paid service jobs, while the profits go back to the owners, go back to the private companies or foreign companies as a whole. It's also important to note that the people who own those islands are outsiders, which means that even though those are islands in the Caribbean, locals or majors don't have much power over these islands. Instead, those foreigners have the ability to take control over these islands or take over this for profits as a whole. Well, on their side, they also talk a point on how nations, they should have the freedom to choose their own path for development. You don't think this argument actually stands at the end of this debate, because for one thing, we have never said we're removing choice. This is not a debate on personal autonomy. Rather, this debate focuses on which is actually best for Caribbean or for the locals, and whether this rise does more harm than good. Know that this rise already happens, and that is why we're having this debate in the first place. On our side, what we support is a more sustainable, more community-based tourism instead of this inauthentic tourism where travelers, they will only be attracted to the beauty, to the luxury of those private islands in the first place, which on our side, we actually give locals ownership and we're able to preserve culture rather than turning this over land and rather than giving the benefit for foreign corporations since they have the control over land of these islands in the first place. And second of all, the second clash we believe is also as important is on why this rise is particularly bad. Because we will prove to you how without these cruise private islands, these Caribbean lands can actually develop better and have more opportunities. For a fact, for one thing, without private cruise islands locking tourists in, then tourists would actually visit actual towns, markets, and other specific cultural sites. Directly, this will in turn support the local businesses, because most of the time, hotels or different kinds of services inside the hotels are popping up, not just in the Caribbean, but in other places as well. And this has attracted tourists, and tourists feel like they can easily swim in an artificial pool instead of going to real beaches. And we believe this detrimentally harms the real authentic experience of traveling, since on their side of the house, what they promote throughout this entire debate is that, oh, how local tourists, they can work for those private islands, for those cruise ships, and how they can still make money and contribute to society. We don't see how this works, and we don't think this is any beneficial or even better than on our side of the house. Because on our side, we are voting and we're supporting for a more independent kind of country in which those locals, they can sell and they can showcase the true richness and beauty of Caribbean instead of attracting travelers or tourists to go to these private islands and spend their a week there just so that they can drink some wine, look at the view, and then relax on their couch or their sofa. And we believe that government, they can also promote festivals on their side and gives more authentic and simply just deeper experiences. Because if these lands were actually developed by local government or Caribbean Caribbean, then the profit would actually stay within the country. So they could build other places like eco-resorts or other historical sites and basically highlight the true culture and natural beauty of the area. So overall, what we deserve to win is really simple. Because on the other side, here are a couple of things that they make. Here are a couple of mistakes that they make throughout this entire debate. First of all, they just completely assume that with the rise of those cruise-owned private islands, then magically somehow the lives of locals in these areas will flourish and they'll be able to just neglect their original work in the locals in their towns just so that they can serve those private islands altogether. This is not your American dream. We believe that how this works is far more devastating than what you thought it would be, and we have done more than enough to tell you how on our side we're able to provide a more authentic experience and also solve the problem of ecological degradation. We also prove to you how this affects the environment and how people can exploit the locals for their profits. Proud to propose.